Princess Rose stood at the massive observation window of the Imperial Palace, watching the three moons of her homeworld rise against a backdrop of endless stars. Her reflection showed a tall figure with silver-tinted skin and eyes that seemed to hold galaxies within them, a perfect example of the ruling species of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. She sighed, touching the cool glass with one delicate hand. Below her, the capital city stretched endlessly, its crystal spires reaching toward the stars like frozen fountains of light. Today, she had rejected her 100th suitor, and her father, the emperor, was not pleased. "Your Highness," a soft voice called from behind her. "The emperor requests your presence in the grand hall." Rose turned to face her attendant. Keeping her face carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions she could sense from the servant, concern, worry, and a touch of fear. Being an empath sometimes felt more like a curse than a gift. "Tell me, Bay," Rose said to her attendant, "do you think I'm being difficult?" Bay, a shorter member of their species with pale blue skin, shifted uncomfortably. "It's not my place, though." "Please," Rose interrupted, "just be honest. The entire galaxy watches you, Your Highness. Each rejection becomes news across 1,000 worlds." The Prince of the Metal Worlds left in such anger that trade negotiations have suffered. Rose walked across the polished floor, her ceremonial robes flowing behind her like liquid starlight. "He wanted our empire's power, not me. Just like all the others." She paused, letting her empathic senses confirm what she already knew. "I felt his greed, his ambition. There wasn't a spark of genuine interest in me as a person." The grand corridors of the palace stretched before them as they walked toward the emperor's hall. Servants and officials bowed as she passed, but Rose felt their judgmental thoughts pressing against her mind. They all thought the same thing. Why couldn't the princess just choose someone and fulfill their duty? The massive doors to the grand hall opened silently. Inside, her father sat upon the stellar throne, a marvel of engineering that showed real-time holograms of every major world in their empire. Today, many of those worlds glowed red, a sign of diplomatic tensions. "Rose," her father's voice boomed across the hall, "you cannot continue this behavior." She stood straight, meeting his gaze. "Father, No." He raised a hand. "Listen, our empire spans 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. We are the most advanced civilization known to exist. Yet my daughter, refuses every suitable match presented to her. The Diamond Kingdoms have withdrawn their alliance offer. The Cybernetic Collective threatens to revoke our mining rights. Even the ancient houses of the core worlds whisper that perhaps our line has grown too proud." Rose felt his frustration, his genuine concern for their empire's stability. But beneath it all, she also sensed his love for her, which made this harder. "I cannot marry without love," she said simply. "Our gift lets us sense emotions. How can you ask me to bind myself to someone whose every feeling toward me is calculated for political gain?" The emperor's expression softened slightly. "We all make sacrifices for the empire, daughter. I did not love your mother when we married, but love grew between us. Sometimes duty must come first. And sometimes duty blinds us to better paths," Rose countered. "Our empire is stagnant, father. We haven't had a truly new idea in centuries. We just polish what we already have until it shines brighter. Maybe," she hesitated, then continued, "maybe we need something different. Someone different." Her father leaned back in his throne, studying her. "You speak of change, yet reject the very alliances that could bring new blood into our line." "I reject false promises and empty hearts." Rose lifted her chin. "When I find someone real, someone true, you'll know it. I'll know it. Until then, I cannot, will not, settle for less." The emperor waved his hand in dismissal, and Rose felt his resignation. As she left the grand hall, she didn't realize that her words would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. For at that very moment, a ship from a small blue planet called Earth was preparing to make first contact with the Empire. carrying with it someone who would change everything. The Imperial reception hall buzzed with excitement as the first human delegation prepared to enter. Rose watched from her elevated position beside the stellar throne as hundreds of ambassadors from across the galaxy whispered among themselves. Most had never seen a human before, and rumors about these newcomers had spread quickly through the Empire. The grand doors swung open, and the human delegation entered. Rose's empathic senses immediately picked up a jumble of emotions from them: wonder, nervousness, determination, and something else she rarely felt in the palace: genuine curiosity. Her eyes were drawn to one particular human near the front of the group. Unlike the others in their formal diplomatic attire, he wore a simple dark uniform with minimal decorations. His alert eyes scanned the room constantly, and she realized he must be part of their security detail. Presenting the representatives of Earth, the herald announced, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. Led by Ambassador White, with their diplomatic corps and security team. Rose observed as the humans approached the throne. Their movements were different from the graceful glides of her people or the mechanical precision of the cybernetic collective. They walked with a natural, almost predatory grace that spoke of a species that had evolved as hunters. The security officer's eyes met hers for a brief moment. Unlike everyone else in the room, he didn't immediately look away in deference. Instead, he assessed her with the same professional detachment he'd shown while scanning the room. The sensation was so unusual that Rose found herself focusing on him. "Your Imperial Majesties," Ambassador White began the formal greeting. "Earth extends its friendship to the Stellar Empire." As the traditional diplomatic exchanges continued, Rose stretched out her empathic senses toward the security officer. What she felt surprised her. While the ambassadors projected the expected mix of ambition and careful calculation, his emotions were clear and uncomplicated. Focus on his duty, protectiveness toward his team, and not a trace of the awe or greed she usually sensed from visitors to the palace. "The humans are primitive by our standards," her father whispered to her, "but they've achieved faster than light travel in mere centuries, while it took other races millennia. We must be cautious with them." Rose nodded absently, still watching the security officer. During the following reception, she observed how he moved through the crowd, always keeping his delegation in sight. He turned down offered drinks from servants, stayed away from the exotic foods, and maintained his vigilance even as others relaxed. "Interested in the primitives, Your Highness." A voice dripping with disdain came from behind her. Rose turned to face Lord Bright, one of her rejected suitors. "They achieved in centuries what your people still haven't managed in millennia," she replied coolly, noting how his emotional aura flared with anger. She walked away from the furious lord, deliberately moving toward the human security team. As she approached, the officer noticed her immediately, shifting his position slightly to better protect his charges if needed. "Your Highness," he said simply, giving a short bow. Correct in form, but without the usual flourish. "You know our protocols well," she observed. "James, Your Highness. And yes, it's my job to know these things." His response was direct, without the usual flattery she encountered. "You're not impressed by all this." She gestured at the grand hall, curious about his unusual emotional state. A slight smile touched his lips. "It's impressive. But I've learned that fancy buildings and titles don't tell you much about people themselves." Rose felt no deception in his words, no hidden agenda. It was refreshing, like stepping into clean air after being in a perfumed room too long. Before she could respond, a commotion broke out near the ambassadors. James immediately turned his attention there, his focus absolute. "Excuse me, Your Highness," he said, already moving toward the disturbance. Rose watched him go, intrigued. For the first time in years, she'd met someone who saw past her title, who didn't want anything from her. And strangely, that made her want to know more about him. In the following days, she would find reasons to learn more about these humans, particularly their intriguing security officer who treated a princess like a person. Rose found herself walking through the palace gardens, a place she had specifically chosen for today's cultural exchange meeting. James walked beside her, his attention divided between their conversation and his surroundings, ever the security officer. "So your people really choose their own mates?" Rose asked, genuinely fascinated, without considering political alliances or genetic compatibility. "Most of us do," James replied, pausing to look at a floating crystal flower. "Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But it's our choice to make." Rose watched as he reached out to touch the crystal petals, noting how his emotions remained clear and uncomplicated, simple curiosity and appreciation for the beauty before him. No hidden motives, no political calculations. "Your gardens are quite something," he said, withdrawing his hand. "But I noticed there's no soil, no actual living plants." "Living plants are inefficient," Rose explained. "These crystal formations provide the same aesthetic value without requiring maintenance." James shook his head slightly. "That's where we disagree. Real plants might be messy and require work, but they're alive. They change, grow, surprise you. There's beauty in imperfection." His words struck a chord in Rose. She sensed his genuine belief in what he was saying, so different from the carefully scripted responses she usually received. "Tell me about Earth's gardens," she found herself asking. "They're chaotic compared to this." He gestured around them. "Wild sometimes, especially in spring. Colors everywhere, bees buzzing around, leaves falling in autumn. Every day they're slightly different." As they walked, Rose noticed the palace guards maintaining their distance, clearly uncomfortable with a human being so close to their princess. But she had insisted on these meetings, claiming diplomatic necessity. "Your people seem nervous about humans," James observed, having noticed the guards' behavior. "You're unpredictable," Rose replied honestly. "Most species follow clear patterns, but humans, you do things differently. Like yesterday, when you helped that servant who dropped their tray. Was I not supposed to? No one else would have. It wasn't your place or responsibility." James stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Where I come from, helping someone who needs it isn't about place or responsibility. It's just being human." Rose felt the truth in his words, along with something else, a gentle defiance against artificial social barriers. It was refreshing, like a cool breeze in a stagnant room. "Your species is strange," she said, smiling slightly. "You have no genetic enhancements, minimal cybernetic integration, and your lifespans are barely 2 centuries. Yet you act as if you're equal to anyone in the galaxy. Aren't we?" James asked simply. "Different, sure, but not lesser." His complete belief in those words radiated through her empathic senses. There was no arrogance, just a quiet confidence that she found strangely attractive. Most species would be intimidated by all this. Rose gestured to the palace rising above them. "But you treat it like it's just another place." "Because it is," James replied. "Impressive, beautiful even, but still just a place. You're the same way. Impressive, beautiful, but still a person." The words slipped out naturally, and Rose felt his immediate flash of embarrassment at the unplanned compliment. Unlike the practiced flattery she usually received, this accidental honesty made her heart beat faster. "I should check in with my team," James said, professional mask sliding back into place. "Of course," Rose replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Same time tomorrow." He nodded, gave a proper bow, and walked away. Rose watched him go, her empathic senses still tingling from their interaction. For the first time in her life, she understood why her ancestors had written poetry about emotional connections. In the crystal garden's perfect symmetry, a small imperfection caught her eye. A tiny crack in one of the flowers where James had touched it. Strangely, she thought it made the flower more beautiful, not less. The universe, she was beginning to realize, might have more to teach her about beauty, love, and life than she had imagined. And her teacher was turning out to be a simple human security officer who saw the world so differently from anyone she had ever known. The imperial court erupted in chaos as Prince Steel of the Metal World stormed into the throne room unannounced. His chrome-plated body gleamed under the crystalline lights, his mechanical eyes fixed on Rose with an intensity that made her empathic senses recoil. "I will not be denied again." His amplified voice boomed across the hall. "The Metal Worlds demand a union with the Stellar Empire. Too long have you delayed, Princess." Rose stood from her smaller throne beside her father, her silver skin shimmering with barely contained anger. "The Metal Worlds demand nothing from me, Prince Steel. My answer remains no." James, standing with the Earth delegation at the edge of the hall, subtly shifted his position. Rose felt his protective instinct flare, though his face remained professionally neutral. "You would reject me for these primitives." Prince Steel gestured toward the human delegation. "I've seen how you spend time with their kind. It's an insult to your bloodline." The Emperor raised his hand for silence. "Prince Steel, you forget yourself. This is not the way of civilized worlds." "Civilized?" Steel laughed harshly. "Your empire grows weak with such thinking. The Metal Worlds offer strength, power, advancement. Yet you let your hair waste time learning about Earth's primitive gardens and simplistic customs." Rose felt James's anger spike at the insult to Earth, but he remained still, watching, waiting. His discipline impressed her. Most species would have reacted by now. "My time is my own," Rose declared. "And I choose to spend it learning about all species, not just those who believe themselves superior." Prince Steel's mechanical body whirred as he stepped closer to the throne. The palace guards tensed, but the prince was technically still a diplomatic guest. "Then learn this," he said, his voice dropping dangerously. "The Metal Worlds have upgraded their fleet. Our new ships carry weapons that could reduce planets to ash. Your empire's defenses, impressive as they are, were designed for last century's wars." The threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Rose felt fear ripple through the court, but from James, she sensed something different. Calculation, strategy, and a strange confidence. "Are you threatening the Stellar Empire?" The Emperor's voice was quiet but carried immense power. "Simply stating facts," Prince Steel replied smoothly. "Facts that Princess Rose should consider carefully before her next rejection." Rose felt trapped. The Metal Worlds were powerful, and if they had truly developed such weapons, her thoughts were interrupted by James clearing his throat. "Your Majesties," he said, stepping forward with a proper bow. "Earth's delegation requests permission to speak." The Emperor nodded, curious. Rose felt James's calm certainty wash over her. "Prince Steel speaks of weapons that could reduce planets to ash," James said. "Impressive. But has your Highness heard of humanity's concept of mutually assured destruction?" Steel turned his mechanical eyes toward James. "What?" "An old Earth philosophy," James continued. "The idea that if both sides can destroy each other, neither side will. Your weapons might destroy our worlds, but it only takes one small ship with the right payload to reach your artificial suns. How long would the Metal Worlds last if their power sources went dark?" The prince's mechanical body stiffened. "You dare." "Not a threat," James said calmly. "Simply stating facts, as you did. Earth may be primitive by your standards, but we've had nuclear weapons for over 2 centuries. We know how to end worlds too. We just choose not to." Rose felt the shift in the room's emotional atmosphere. Prince Steel's confidence had cracked, replaced by uncertainty. He hadn't expected the primitives to understand such strategic thinking. "This discussion is over," the Emperor declared. "Prince Steel, you may leave. The Stellar Empire does not respond to threats, veiled or otherwise." As the prince stalked out, his mechanical dignity somewhat dented, Rose caught James's eye. His small nod carried no triumph, no arrogance, just the quiet satisfaction of a duty well done. In that moment, Rose realized something important. The humans might lack advanced technology, but they understood power in ways her people had forgotten. And James had just saved her from a political nightmare without firing a shot or even raising his voice. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to learn from Earth than just gardens and emotions. The grand ballroom of the Imperial Palace sparkled with the light of 1,000 floating crystals. Diplomats from 50 worlds mingled beneath the artificial stars, celebrating the Empire's 10,000th year. Rose stood on the upper balcony, watching the crowd below, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the swirling emotions. James stood at his usual post near the Earth delegation, but his eyes frequently scanned the room, pausing briefly on her location each time. She had grown used to his protective habits, finding comfort in his vigilance. "Your Highness," Lord Bright appeared beside her, his emotion aura sickly sweet with false courtesy. Such a magnificent celebration, though some of us question the presence of lesser species. Rose felt his spike of hatred as his gaze settled on the human delegation. "Every recognized species has a right to be here, Lord Bright." Of course, he smiled, but his emotions screamed deception. "Would you honor me with a dance?" Before Rose could reply, her empathic senses exploded with warning. Pure murderous intent sliced through the background noise of the party. Her eyes snapped to James, who had already begun moving, his expression tight with alarm. The first explosion rocked the lower level of the ballroom. Time seemed to slow. Rose saw the assassins materialize through failing cloaking devices. Their weapons were aimed at the Earth delegation. No, at her. She was their target, and the humans were in the way. "Down." James's voice cut through the chaos. He was already moving through the crowd, his body language shifting from diplomatic guard to predator. A second explosion separated Rose from Lord Bright. She felt his satisfaction through the chaos. He was part of this. Before she could react, a third blast knocked her off her feet. Strong arms caught her as she fell. James. He had somehow reached her through the chaos. "Service corridor," he said quickly. "Now." They ran as energy bolts sizzled past them. James moved with practiced efficiency, placing his body between her and danger. They reached a small door hidden in the ornate wall panels. "In," he ordered, all protocol forgotten in a crisis. Rose didn't hesitate. The service corridor was narrow, designed for maintenance drones. James sealed the door behind them, then pulled out a small device. "Primitive technology," he said with a grim smile, attaching it to the door. "But effective. That'll slow them down." "The other delegates," Rose began. "Your guards will protect them. You're the target. We need to get you to safety." Rose felt his absolute certainty, his total focus on keeping her alive. No fear, no hesitation, just determination. They moved through the maintenance tunnels, James consulting what looked like a memorized map in his head. Rose realized he must have studied the palace layout extensively. "How did you know?" she asked as they ran. "Noticed Lord Bright hawking to unmarked service droids earlier. Didn't match maintenance schedules. Plus, his body language was off." A blast rocked the tunnel behind them. Their pursuers had broken through. James pulled her into a small alcove, his body shielding hers as debris flew past. Rose felt his heart hammering, but his emotions remained crystal clear. Protect, survive, escape. "The safe room is 2 levels down," she whispered. "They'll expect that," James replied. "We need to be unpredictable." More explosions echoed through the tunnels. The assassins were getting closer. James pulled out a small black device. "Old human trick," he said. "Create chaos." He pressed a button and threw it down the tunnel. Seconds later, darkness and smoke filled the passage. "Maintenance shaft." Rose pointed to a barely visible hatch. "It leads to the garden level." They climbed down the narrow shaft as confusion erupted above them. Rose heard the assassins arguing, unable to track them through the smoke. When they finally emerged in the crystal garden, palace guards were already sweeping the area. The assassination attempt had failed. "You saved my life," Rose said softly, still feeling James's unwavering protective instinct through her empathic sense. "Just doing my job," he replied, But she felt something else in his emotions now. Relief, yes, but also something deeper, something he was trying to hide. In the midst of chaos and danger, Rose made a discovery. Humans didn't just protect out of duty. They protected what they cared about. And James, despite all his professional distance, cared about her. The realization made her heart beat faster than any chase through the tunnels. The Imperial Council chamber was silent as Rose faced her father. The aftermath of the assassination attempt had exposed a deep conspiracy, several noble houses working with the Metal Worlds to force a change in imperial succession. "You must choose now," the Emperor said heavily. "After this attack, the Empire needs stability. Prince Steel has offered protection against the conspirators in exchange for your hand." Rose stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of Empire pressing down on her. Through the grand windows, she could see the Earth diplomatic ships preparing for departure. The humans were leaving today. "You're considering their offer?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "The Metal Worlds have proven their power. With their fleet, we could crush the rebellion before it spreads." Her father's emotions betrayed his conflict. "Sometimes we must sacrifice personal happiness for the greater good." Rose turned to stare out the window. James was down there somewhere, preparing to return to his world light years away. Her empathic senses ached at the thought. "And what of Earth?" she asked. "They are young, primitive. They cannot help us in this crisis." But they already had, Rose thought. A human had saved her life while noble-born conspirators tried to kill her. The primitives had shown more honor than the so-called advanced species. "I cannot marry Prince Steel," she said finally. "Cannot, or will not." Her father's voice hardened. "Both." Rose turned to face him. "I am an empath, father. Every moment in his presence would be torture. His emotions are as artificial as his body. There is nothing there but cold ambition. And I suppose you have found something warmer." The Emperor's tone suggested he knew exactly what, or who, she was thinking about. "I have found truth," Rose replied. "Humans feel deeply, love completely. They don't hide their emotions behind political calculations. They die in the blink of an eye." Her father interrupted. "Their lives are mayflies compared to ours. Would you bind yourself to such fleeting existence?" Rose felt her own emotions crystallize into certainty. "I would rather have a moment of real love than centuries of empty political alliance." "You speak of love." The Emperor stood, his ceremonial robes shimmering. "What do you know of love? You who have rejected every suitable match." "I know that when James saved my life, he didn't do it for political advantage. I know that every time we talked, every emotion was genuine. I know that right now he's leaving because he thinks it's best for me, even though it's tearing him apart inside." Her father stared at her for a long moment. She felt his emotions shift. Anger, frustration, and then, surprisingly, understanding. "Your mother would have liked him," he said finally. "She always said our empire had grown too cold, too calculated." Hope fluttered in Rose's chest. "Father, if you choose this path, it will not be easy. Many will oppose it. The Metal Worlds will be furious. You may lose your claim to the throne." "I know." Rose lifted her chin. "But maybe the Empire needs this. A reminder that there's more to life than power and politics. A demonstration that we can learn from younger species instead of just looking down on them." The Emperor sank back into his throne, suddenly looking tired. "Go," he said softly. "If you're going to change 1,000 years of tradition, you better do it before those ships leave." Rose didn't wait for him to change his mind. She ran from the council chamber, her ceremonial robes flowing behind her. Her empathic senses stretched out, searching for that familiar emotional signature. Clear, strong, honest. She had made her choice. The Empire would have to adapt. Perhaps it was time to plant some real gardens in the palace, to let a little chaos into their perfect order, to learn that love, real love, was worth more than all the power in the galaxy. As she ran toward the spaceport, Rose felt lighter than she had in years. She was choosing her own path, not the one laid out by tradition and politics. And somewhere ahead, a human who had changed everything was preparing to leave, unless she could reach him in time. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if approving of her decision to follow her hearts rather than her crown. 5 years had passed since Rose's decision shocked the galaxy. The Imperial Palace gardens had changed dramatically. Real Earth roses now grew alongside crystal formations, their natural beauty complementing the artificial perfection. Rose stood in her favorite spot, watching James teach their 3-year-old daughter how to plant a seedling. The child's silver skin sparkled in the sunlight, while her dark hair and curious eyes marked her human heritage. "Gently, Star," James said, helping their daughter pat the soil around the tiny plant. "Living things need care and patience." Rose felt their daughter's delight through her empathic senses as the seedling took root. Star had inherited her mother's abilities, but with a uniquely human perspective that made her experience emotions differently. "Will it grow as tall as the crystal trees, Papa?" Star asked, looking up at the towering artificial structures. "No, little one," James smiled. "But it will grow in its own way, and that's what makes it special." The changes in the Empire had grown like those gardens, slowly, organically, but unstoppably. After Rose and James's union, other species began to see humans differently. The primitives had something many advanced civilizations had forgotten: the ability to grow, to change, to love without calculation. "Your Highness," a young aide approached, bowing. "The Metal World's delegation has arrived for the trade negotiations." Rose nodded. Prince Steel had eventually accepted reality, though it had taken a show of force from both the Empire and Earth to convince him. Now, the Metal Worlds were just another trading partner, no more or less important than others. "Tell them we'll begin shortly," she replied. "Family time is sacred in both human and imperial tradition." The aide smiled and withdrew. That was another change. The palace staff now showed real emotions, not just carefully scripted responses. They had learned that efficiency didn't have to mean coldness. James stood up, brushing soil from his uniform. Though he now held a high diplomatic rank, he still preferred his simple security officer's attire. Some things never changed. "Ready for another round of negotiations?" he asked, lifting Star onto his shoulders. "With you there, always." Rose took his hand, feeling the warmth of his emotions: love, pride, contentment. "Though I still think you enjoy watching them try to outmaneuver a primitive human too much. Can't help it if they haven't figured out that straight talk works better than political games," he grinned. Star giggled from her perch. "Papa makes them nervous because he doesn't pretend." "Wisdom from the mouth of babes," Rose quoted one of James's favorite Earth sayings. They walked together toward the palace, the living symbol of how the Empire had evolved. The ancient halls now buzzed with genuine emotions, not just careful diplomacy. Young nobles studied Earth's history alongside imperial protocol. Some had even started traveling to Earth for education, something unthinkable just years ago. "The Emperor wants to talk about Star's education," James said as they walked. "He thinks she could be a bridge between worlds." Rose felt her father's love for his granddaughter through their family bond. The old Emperor had changed too, learning to value the unpredictable vitality the humans had brought to their civilization. "She already is," Rose replied, watching their daughter wave to passing guards who smiled genuinely in return. "Just like her father, she changes things just by being herself." They reached the conference room where the Metal World's delegation waited. Before entering, Rose pulled James close for a kiss, ignoring the scandalized looks from some of the older courtiers. "Ready to show them how a human-imperial partnership really works," she whispered. "Always," he replied, his eyes twinkling with that same confidence that had first caught her attention years ago. As they entered the room together, Rose felt the familiar mix of emotions from the delegates: curiosity, skepticism, respect, and growing understanding. The galaxy was learning what she had discovered in a palace garden 5 years ago. Sometimes the most advanced civilizations had the most to learn from those they considered primitive. And love, real love, could change not just hearts, but empires. Star waved from her father's shoulders at the chrome-plated delegates, her innocent joy cutting through centuries of diplomatic protocol. The future, Rose knew, was in good hands, hands that knew how to plant gardens, protect what mattered, and love without reservation. The empire would never be the same. And that was exactly what it needed.